Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm delighted today to be joined by someone who I've been following since I ran into him on another podcast appearance. Doug Lemov is joining me today. He's the founder of Teach Like a Champion. If you don't know Teach Like a Champion, you should dig in. We'll include links to that in the show notes. He's just written a great book with Colleen Driggs and Erica Woolway, the Teach Like a Champion Guide to the Science of Reading, Translating Research to Reignite Joy and Meaning in the Classroom. I'm joined today by Doug Lemov. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Right, Spike. I'm really happy to be here.
It's amazing to have you. You know, our first encounter was on David Adams' podcast. That's a wonderful podcast, Innovations in Education. You were talking about Teach Like a Champion then, and we'll get into that in a bit. But can we start by hearing about you first, your professional origin story, how you got to this point in your career?
Yeah, sometimes I ask myself the same question. I started off as a teacher right out of college. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but teachers had been such profound influences on me growing up. I'm sure a lot of people can kind of show that resonates with a fair number of people. So I figured I'd pay back the debt of gratitude by becoming a teacher myself. I'm not sure I paid back any debts of gratitude. I think I was an okay teacher. You know, there were a lot of really challenging situations that I came across that I wasn't really sure how to handle. I was an okay teacher, did that for 3 years. I went to grad school in English literature because I thought I was going to be a professor. I'd go to the place where I did my undergrad. And very quickly I realized that being a professor of English is not really about teaching, and that I wasn't going to be happy where teaching wasn't the thing that mattered. So I started looking around for what I wanted to do next as a PhD program dropout. And I connected with a colleague of mine who was starting a charter school. I didn't really know what a charter school was. But we started to talk, and we just connected on some core ideas, which I'm getting too more for what, but I took this crazy leap of moving to Boston. We started a school from scratch. I didn't know you could do that, start a school from scratch. You get to design. It was fascinating. I did that for 3 years. About halfway through, she left and, went up. She had been working on some information technology, some software. She went out to Silicon Valley to make a go of it. This was 1997, so that was a great move. And she said, "Guess what? You're in charge." I was like, I looked over my shoulder. I was like, "Me?" So I was the head of that school for a while. And then I worked at the authorizer of charter schools in New York State for a year or two, thinking about accountability systems and how we would know whether schools really were better. I did an MBA, and during the course of the MBA, I started to think a lot about sort of scalable education solutions. And I was working with schools after I got my MBA, and I was struck by how often, I went to visit this particular school. It was in upstate New York. And I really, really loved the people who ran that school. They were so thoughtful and they wanted to do right by kids. And if I can be honest, I'm not going to name them because the school was really terrible. It was heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking to see good people struggling and failing. And they had been to see one of the best schools that I knew, one of the original KIPP schools in New York City. And I asked the principal, what did you take away from your visit to KIPP? And, if you were going to list the 50 most important things about, watching Dave Levin, who's a legend, teach math. He probably mentioned number 36 and number 48. It's like he wasn't watching the same game that I think that I would have been watching. And so I was driving back from this visit with a colleague, and we just started to make a list of what are the things that master teachers do? What are the things you should be looking for? Made this list, starting to I mentioned the MBA. I built these regression analyses of if you put poverty on the x-axis, current student achievement on the y-axis, you get a pretty devastating picture of American education, which is if you have the lack of foresight to be born into a census tract without privilege, your educational outcomes are less likely, very clearly less likely to be positive. But in every one of those census tracts, there's always a dot in the upper right-hand corner. There's some teacher who does miraculous work, who is getting incredible results. So I started to try and sneak into those teachers' classrooms to see what they did that made them a little better.
And just to jump in real quick, to give you some credit here, you're one of the few folks who left to get an MBA and then turned that MBA capability back on the classroom. And it's borne real fruit for you. But I think it is worth noting that a lot of people, we lose people like you who wind up working somewhere else. And then the fact that you were able to kind of bring that acumen back in is notable.
It was stunningly useful. I mean, like, so I had a little reminder on my Outlook calendar every month and it said drop out. She was just a reminder that like, I knew I wanted to stay in education. If it wasn't useful to me, I should stop doing it. You know, I was in my 30s when I got my MBA. I was this weird, old guy, you know, but a lot of the core concepts that became really important in how I viewed classrooms, I learned that in an MBA program, like transaction cost is like how much time and effort it makes to execute a transaction. Transaction cost is really important in the classroom. How long it takes me to like set up an activity and run it. Like I can spend, the activity could be really great, but I spend 20 minutes setting it up and explaining it to everyone. And now like, I'm not sure it's, there are lots of concepts.
Yeah. Even the way you think about decision-making, because I still remember that from David's interview where you were talking about the sheer number of decisions that a teacher has to make. It's almost like a middle management challenge where there's like so many decisions and folks really aren't trained on decision making.
Exactly right. And we can talk about that. Actually, the decision making for teachers is such complex work. And I had learned a lot about that actually studying athletes also, which would be another digression that
we got multiple episodes we could get into. Yeah.
I ended up sneaking into teachers' classrooms and videotaping them. I'd been an athlete growing up. The idea of like game tape was really intuitive to me. So I took the sort of concepts that we put together, like what is a great teacher, to try to like gather video of amazing teachers doing it. That became Teach Like a Champion. And then just kind of kept, the amazing thing was I would share what were then decent videos. Teachers would take them and use them and they would do incredible things with them. And like within weeks of writing the first version of Teach Like a Champion, I was planning my second and now it's in its third edition.
Yeah.
And that, one of the things I love about it is that it shines a light on the incredible work that so many teachers do. Like, there's nothing that makes me happier than when you walk into a school building with one of the teachers who you videotape. Colleen Driggs is my co-author in the read is one of them. And like, once I went to a school, people were like, Colleen Driggs is here. And I was like, that is the way that teachers should be greeted when they want them to start teachers. They should, it should be a little bit of a celebrity moment.
Yeah. Which is really amazing. And you can see how it's taken off and there's different dimensions to it. Folks can check out the website link that we'll include in the show notes. And then the newest foray, the book that's just hitting the presses now, is the Teach Like a Champion Guide to the Science of Reading. Science of Reading is a buzzword that's been out there. I'm excited for you to give us a little more meat on the bone there, and translating research to reignite joy and meaning in the classroom. Great title, lots in it. What made you focus here now?
Yeah. We've been writing, I think Colleen and Erica and I have been writing about reading for some time. You can't spend much time in schools and not realize everything we teach in schools is important, but reading is the first among equals. But also, if you look at a great school, you take a positive outlier school, that school can typically close the gap between kids who aren't born to privilege and kids with the greatest opportunity in 2 to 3 years in math, right? It's not uncommon to see that. You almost never see that kind of progress and gap closing with reading. I think we've known for a long time that we're not as good at teaching reading. Both we're not good at teaching reading, and reading is harder, right? There's much stronger correlation between socioeconomic status and outcomes in reading than there is in math and other subjects. So I think we've been interested in it for a long time. I have a previous book about reading called Reading to Consider. But I also think that over the course of our work, we've become more and more interested and focused on cognitive science and more aware that, particularly in reading, you can't just talk about techniques, which is what I talk about in Teach Like a Champion, without also talking about curriculum design. So this book is, you mentioned that the science of reading is a buzzword. It is a buzzword for tragic reasons, but happily it is now a buzzword. It's important. But it requires translation, and it requires understanding, and it requires both a look at both teaching and curriculum. And so we really tried to talk about the overlap between what does the science tell us? How do we translate that science both into like the actions that we take in the classroom and the way that we design lessons and what we ask students to read and how we ask them to read it? So that was a crazy thing to try. It's done now.
Exactly. And it's available for folks. We'll include links to the book on the show page as well. And then, the story is relatively recent, but maybe we could refresh folks on that too, where, you began with a podcast, sold a story where Emily Hanford released this podcast, talks about how there was flawed science behind a lot of what was being rolled out around teaching reading. Can you give us a condensed version of where we were and then where we are now?
Yeah, and I should say, as I give you the condensed version, that the story is like the science of reading is a phrase born in tragedy about early reading acquisition. And our book is not about early reading acquisition, but I think we want to take the lessons from that. So Emily Hanford's podcast told a story. Everyone should listen to it. It's the most important piece of education journalism in the last 25 years. She basically tells the story of early reading acquisition, which is students learning to read in kindergarten, first grade, second grade.
Yeah.
How fundamentally important to that systematic synthetic phonics is, teaching kids to break down words and understand the code of letter sound correspondence.
Yep.
The science has been overwhelmingly clear on that for more than 25 years. And yet the leading early reading programs in this country ignored that science and proposed socialized teachers to use flawed and faulty methods to teach reading for decades. And the cost to kids who didn't learn to read or didn't learn to read optimally or barely learned to read, but learned to hate reading, the costs have been dizzying. And it happened there are a lot of reasons for why it happened. But one of the reasons that it happened is because the worlds of science and the world of education are disconnected. And, teachers are taught to believe in ideologies, but they don't go to graduate school and learn cognitive science of learning or reading. And that, it's logical that we tried to build reading programs based on what seemed logical for years because we didn't have the science. And so we had to rely on just like our best guess of like careful observation. What does it seem like works in reading? But now we have in the last 25 years learned more about how people learn to read than we have in the last 250, combined.
Right.
And now it's time to change the shape of the profession and have the profession be grounded in and understand research and then use and apply that research. And so our book is really like taking the lesson of early reading, which is tragic and is only changing out. Like one of the responses to Emily's podcast was 20 states passed legislation outlining unscientific early reading programs. That is probably not the most efficient way to change teaching practice, but it shows you the level of outrage.
Right.
By the populace when they find that the people who they trust to do something very important have not been attentive to and I don't mean teachers here, I really mean the profession. Teachers, I think, are victims of this too. They worked really hard having been given flawed materials. And so we want to take that lesson and apply it more broadly. So beyond K-1-2 language acquisition, what does the science tell us about the rest of the life of a reader from third grade to 12th grade? And even to college, I have 3 kids. One of them's in high school, one of them's in college, and one of them just graduated college. And like, do I think it's relevant to what's happening on our college campus as the science of reading? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what does the science tell us about grades 3 to 12? How we can be better at the craft of teaching reading and making sure that we have a reading capable populace?
Yeah. And that translation function that you're talking about is an important one. It speaks to that breakdown between the research and the practice. And hopefully you're able to start to bridge some of that more around comprehension and slightly older kids. And that's why I was really pleased to see you starting early by talking about attention and about how books are dying and about how a lot of the ways in which we set expectations for kids and their ability to attend to things and understand different formats. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. Well, the first chapter is about attention. And I think it's interesting because, a lot of, I was sort of saying like some of the science has been out there for 25 years.
Yeah.
Some of it is relatively new. Some of it is relatively new because society is changing. And one of the, I think, least acknowledged changes is the changes in the cognition of the populace brought about by the proliferation of screens and smartphones and social media.
Marshall McLuhan was right.
Yes, the medium is the message. I want to come back to that phrase because we talk about it a lot in the book, and I think it's really important. But social media, a cell phone is an attention fracturing machine. It socializes you to need constant new information every few seconds. And so your phone distracts you. Even turned over on the table in the room, you're distracted, but you're itching to check and see what the novel information coming in your phone is. And after a while, you're socialized to think that way. You don't even need your phone to be distracted anymore. I write about this epiphany about one of the children, one of the 3 co-authors' children, who happens to be one of my kids, who I required to read when he was in high school. And I would see him reading. He'd be lying on his back on the couch. He'd be reading the same book that maybe I had read 30 years before, but his cell phone would be sitting on his chest. And as he read, he'd be reading, dude, what's up? We're over at Byron's. You coming over? Read a couple. But dude, you have the math homework? That girl in your math, when are you going to ask her out, right?
Yeah.
And so just the level of engagement, you should be lost in a thought world when you're reading. And he was not. It's not just that kids read less, and that we can talk about this. The data is overwhelming that kids read less, but that they also read differently. And they read in an attentionally fractured way. And so this presents a choice to us as educators. We concede the field. We can concede that like kids are different. They don't have the same attention span. And we can show them instead, we can have them read very short texts in class, and we can have them watch videos instead. They will be much more engaged in that. It'll be a lot easier to teach that.
Yeah.
Or we can decide that part of our job is that it's actually really important to be able to sustain states of concentration, and that reading in particular is an intentionally demanding, but also an intentionally rewarding activity that rewards states of deep attention. And we can build our classrooms around the idea that we're going to try and rebuild students' attentional capacity by having them read for 5, then 8 and 10 minutes steadily unbroken so that they can sustain their concentration in a text. And so I think the most important phrase in that chapter is we wire how we fire. The brain is neuroplastic. After a while, if you read in a constant state of half attention, or you live in a constant state of half attention, your brain adapts to function that way. You become distractible. But the flip side of that is that if you practice being attentive and you practice reading in a state of deep concentration, we can also rewire your brain. Every time you read, you're wiring your brain to read a certain way.
Yeah.
Just go like that one little like digression into, we learn to read and speak very differently. We've been speaking as a species for 250,000 years.
Yeah.
So our brains have evolved to make it easy for us to learn to speak. It's been evolutionary, highly beneficial to a human being to learn to speak. And so over that, over those hundreds of thousands of years, we have developed parts of our brains that are dedicated to speech recognition, speech production. And so a baby left untutored, surrounded by people, will start to babble and mimic them and speak on its own. We've been reading for 5,000 years, and only some of us have been reading, only a few of us have been reading for those 5,000 years. And so we have not had time for our brains to evolve to facilitate reading. So every time you're reading, you are rewiring parts of your brain that are designed for other functions.
Right.
And so the way that you rewire shapes the way that you can read. If you rewire like my son on the couch constantly, you will become a distracted reader. If you wire for states of attentiveness, focus, and deep reading, that's what you become capable of doing. So the first chapter is one just like calling people's attention to the importance of attention. One of our phrases, high text, low tech. Let's read from actual books. Let's get the screens out of the classroom. Let's give kids pencils and pens so they could be like annotating the text as they're reading it to harvest their concentration. Let's try to cause them to read for sustained periods of time. And that means, interestingly, bringing the book back into the classroom, which is, you wouldn't think, that would be a strange thing to say, but very little reading actually happens in reading classrooms in middle school and in high school. And I think one of the things we're implicitly saying is like, we should be reading more together in the classroom.
Yeah.
So we can shape the way that people read.
In your subtitle, Translating Research to Reignite Joy and Meaning in the Classroom.
Yeah.
And when I think back to my education, like growing up, it's also the great books that I read. And then the great books that I read that we talked about in class with some of my great teachers. And like that for me, in terms of identity formation and like just meaningful experiences in my life that I still remember, it's very much tied to reading whole books. And my wife's an academic librarian, so she's the one who let me know about the whole books problem. But the fact that, we've actually moved away from something that was actually better, and then to do it in that social meaning making, shared meaning experience. Can you talk about the meaning making aspect of this as well?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on something that's really important. Awesome. We think is really important to understanding human beings, which is how social we are. I think it's really interesting that, if you look at the reading behaviors of young people, reading rates are going through the floor, and adults are also reading far less. But in an era when people read less and less, the book club has become, it's like much more popular. Like that's how a lot of people do their reading. Why do they do that? Right? They do that because this is where stories started. Like we were around the campfire before we could even write text. Like the shared experience of a story together shares critical information, but it bonds us and connects us. And like we laugh together, I think I tell the story in the book of like my kids were home from school for a vacation and we're watching a movie as a family. And I noticed that while we're watching the movie, I kept on looking over at them on the couch at my wife and kids to like see when I'm laughing, are they laughing too? And like when I'm like getting choked up, are they getting choked up too? What a strange behavior. Why would you do that? Why would you not look at the screen of the movie? Because part of the experience is experiencing it together, be connected by it and have it. That's part of what makes it meaningful.
Yeah.
And I do think that if the book has a hope in its death struggle against the smartphone, one of its gifts is that it's more social. A cell phone is an isolating technology and a book is a connecting technology. And so if we bring the book in the classroom, we read it together and maybe even we read aloud together. And suddenly we're all laughing at the same scene. They're gasping at the same scenes. It makes it more meaningful and more memorable to us. Also, I get this sort of signal from my peers that like, actually they're enjoying reading this book too. The book is meaningful to them too. And I do think that what you pointed out, like making it a shared experience, making the social experience is going to be really, really important. I think one of the tragic ways that not quite tragic, one of the unfortunate ways that a lot of teachers have responded to the decline in young people's reading rates is to say, well, if I just let them choose whatever book they want to read, and everyone goes off into the corner of the room and reads their own book, that will cause them to want to read more because choice will motivate. Well, first of all, I'm just not sure of like how valid that argument. I went once I work in the sports sector a lot. And I went to this school for soccer players. It's part of like an MLS academy and they have a school attached. And at the school, the kids are allowed to choose books to read on their own. What do you think they're choosing to read about? They're reading biographies of Cristiano Ronaldo. And like, is that, like they choose that because they don't know much else. But like, is someone who's read 4 books in their lives, is a young person like that, who, all the wisdom of their 14 years, the optimal person to say like, this is the best book for you to read? Or is it an adult putting Animal Farm in their hands and saying, this book will change your life, you should read this?
Right.
And actually, we should all read it together because the shared experience of talking about it will show you how powerful a book can be as a tool to connect to other people. And so I think choice is important, right? And kids should read independently and they should have choice of if they read independently. But in the classroom, we argue for shared books and like carefully chosen. For a lot of kids, the only books that they will read will be the books that we read in school. So book choice is very, very important. And if you're going to read 20 books in your youth, I'm sorry, but Cristiano Ronaldo's biography does not cut it, right? It's not in the top 1,000, never mind the top 20.
Right.
And actually, if I can bring Animal Farm to life for you and show you the depth and power of that book, just maybe, I have a hope of I like my chances of making a reader better than you sitting in a beanbag in the corner reading, whatever seemed plausible to you as a 14-year-old.
Exactly. There's a lot of real examples. You go real deep into close reading, which I wanted to get a little more from you on that. Maybe let's go there next. Close reading and then other sort of tactics, other approaches to the classroom that actually can kind of open things up perhaps in new ways.
Yeah. Thanks for asking about close reading, by the way. Nobody asks about close reading. It's the last chapter in the book. And Colleen was really instrumental, Colleen, my co-author, pushing us to make the last chapter on this distinct. It's a lot of the purpose of what we do, which is, I'll just start with some of the data, which is the barrier to students in college is complex text. That is, there's a really fascinating data set made by the makers of the ACT. And so this is based on like millions of test takers of the ACT. They correlated their ACT scores to how they did in college subsequently. And the first thing that they did was they just dropped a line down the ACT test scores at 21. And basically at 21 is like, this is the line at which if you don't score 21 on the ACT reading test, you're at risk of being in trouble. It means you're going to struggle to do the reading in the course to either keep up or to be able to read complex texts. You're likely to have to take remedial courses. That's going to be more expensive for you. You're at risk now for dropping out. You want to get a 21. So then they did a bunch of really interesting things where they disaggregated different types of questions on the ACT to figure out what are the things that are problematic for students who don't get to 21. And so they looked at inferential versus literal questions. And if you look at the graph of how students did on inferential versus literal questions across the spectrum of scores, there's basically no difference between how you did on those types of questions, no matter where you were. If you scored a 20, if you scored a 30 on the ACT, you basically got the same percentage of questions that were literal and figurative correct. So this tells us that like being able to do figurative work is not, you score basically the same no matter what.
Yeah.
Same thing for like transferable skills, main idea and inference. Students you don't see a difference in how they perform. But when they disaggregated the data by text complexity, there was an overwhelming message in the curve. And the curve was students below 21. Basically, if you group text into like simple, more complex, and very complex, with very complex text, they score about 30% correct. In other words, they're guessing. It's a multiple choice test. They're guessing, right? And so the makers of this study were like, the single biggest barrier to preparation for college success is your ability to read complex text. What Animal Farm is a great, Animal Farm or Lord of the Flies is a great example. Like, it has complex, difficult sentences with subject and verb, subject and object inverted, and complex vocabulary. It's hard to understand.
Yeah.
One of the mistakes that we make is like leveled text. If kids never read a challenging book and they don't know how to struggle with challenging text and how to make meaning when meaning is difficult, they are not prepared to go to college or, to be able to read the things that they need to read. I think it's really scary to imagine a future where the people who can read any archaic, very challenging text, for example, the Constitution of the United States, case law from the 18th century, or Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, if the only people who can read those are specialists, just think about that from a perspective of our democracy, what that means.
Mm-hmm.
Kids have to be able to read hard text. They have to have experience doing it.
Yeah.
But how? So the close reading chapter is about how you do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of it is about using the cognitive science of attention and working memory to put complex text in attentionally privileged settings. So we show this really beautiful video of a teacher in England, and she's teaching Lord of the Flies. And there's this sentence at the beginning of the Lord of the Flies where Ralph, who's one of the protagonists, for your listeners who may not know the story, it's a group of boarding school boys. It's set in the future, but they're like 1950s boarding school boys, very elite boys from England, who they're in a plane crash on an island and there's no adults. So they have to, rebuild society. And it starts off very idealistically and then it becomes very dark very fast. And so there's this scene at the very beginning that she wants, this line that's very it's full of foreshadowing, where Ralph, one of the main characters, rips off his clothes savagely and, tears off like the symbols of society in a way that like Golding's language is very implies the savagery beneath the surface of the boys. It's a really hard sentence to read. And so what the teacher does is she projects it on the board next to an alternative version of the sentence where instead of saying Ralph tore off his clothes, it says Ralph removed his clothes. Instead of, savagely, it said enthusiastically, right? And so by comparing a very small amount of text, a single line, right, which they can study the whole line with their working memory and not be trying to pay attention to too many things at once. And looking at it, being able to compare very similar but slightly different iterations of the text, suddenly you can say oh, this sentence means something completely different when I change those two words. And so it teaches me to see how meaning is made by studying complex sentences at the individual level.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really important is, human working memory, conscious thinking, where we do our most important analytical work, where we wrestle with ideas, very powerful, but very small. We can really hold a tiny amount of information in our working memory at any given time. Phone numbers in every country in the world are no more than 7 digits, because that's really the most you can hold on to at one time in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to work hard to keep things there. And we're always forgetting things. Like people say that working memory, its duration is between 15 and 20 seconds.
Yeah.
So I meet you at a party and you're like, hi, I'm Michael. I'm like, hi, I'm Doug. And then I turn to greet someone else, I'm already at risk of forgetting your name a few seconds later, because that's just how working memory works.
Mm-hmm.
But if this really challenging sentence is projected on the board, then I can constantly refresh my working memory a bit. And I can say, okay, talk about it. How does this relate to what happened in the previous scene? How does this compare to this other sentence? Then I can go back and reread the sentence again and remind myself of what's in that sentence and compare it to the other idea that's in my working memory.
Yeah.
So a lot of this chapter is about how do we take very challenging text and present it to students in ways that makes them most likely to be able to learn from it and respond to it, and therefore not be afraid of it. And to learn to be comfortable struggling and have tools to struggle with the most difficult, but often the most important forms of text that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Amazing stuff. Breaking it down here with Doug Lemov, the Teach Like a Champion founder, and there's a new Guide to the Science of Reading out from Doug and crew that we'll include links to in the show notes. Made it this far without talking about artificial intelligence explicitly. So there, I went ahead and did it. You know, a lot of where you seem to be moving towards is real caution around using some of this stuff. And even like when you were describing these texts, the second example, not the original text, sounded a little more like the synthetic passages that can be generated by lazy use of AI. How are you thinking about AI? I know everyone's kind of freaking out about it, understandably, but how does this relate to your work?
Yeah. I would not describe myself as an AI expert by any. I'm probably an AI skeptic and maybe a little bit of like, I think there are probably some applications which will be able to save teachers time and some of their important tasks. But I don't think that students, I think that like most people recognize that AI is a hack on thinking. It causes you not to have to think. And what we want to have students do when they learn is to think. So I think a lot of what you hear about responses to AI is, you know, bringing the blue book back into the classroom, that if I don't know whether students' writing is their own, whether they thought about it when they do it outside the classroom, I should bring the writing back into the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's promising. You know, one of the chapters of our book is about the power of writing and how important writing is generally to thinking and specifically to learning to read. And so some of the things that are really important about writing and why it's so important to be attentive to how much to have students do a lot of writing about text and to have specific types of writing to make sure that their writing is done in specific ways, is that it's durable and it's difficult and it's slow. Yeah. And those things are really important. One of the benefits of it, you know, we speak at 150 words per minute, but when we write, if you're in my class and I say, you know, how is Jonas changing in the chapter? Michael, you know, playing you respond. A couple of things have happened there. First of all, like maybe you're the most eager student in class and you always raise your hand, and there are 25 kids in the class who know they're never going to raise their hand faster than you. And so they're not going to answer the question, so they're checked out. But if I say, take 30 seconds and jot down your thoughts, how was Jonas changing the chapter? Go. First thing that happens there is like everyone writes the answer, which causes them to think deliberately about it. Second thing that happens is if we start having a discussion about the book, I can listen better if I've written down my thoughts first. I think this is a straight application of like, to go back to like the finite nature of working memory. Yeah. It is very, very hard to hold your own answer in your head, what I wanted to say about Jonas, and listen to someone else at the same time. That's two different complex tasks in working memory at the same time. It's really hard to do that. And so what we see is a lot of like, I might call on a student, I might call on you first and you give an answer, and then I call on Colleen and Colleen says, well, what I was going to say is, right? That's a really interesting preliminary phrase. What I was going to say is basically say, I'm going to say what I was going to say before Michael spoke. In fact, I wasn't even really listening, and what he said is ultimately very relevant to me. Yeah. Which like, that is a very clear signal to you that your peers didn't value your response, and it results in people talking past each other instead of listening to each other. Yeah. But if I say, jot down your thoughts for 30 seconds and you answer, then, you know, you give an answer, then Colleen she doesn't have to try to be thinking about what her answer was while you're talking, because it's written down in front of her. Then she can glance at her answer while she's talking and say, what Michael said was interesting, and it connects to what I was saying, which is what I was thinking, which is this. And now we have people talking to each other. So I think that's one thing that's really important. And the second thing about the slowness of writing is to be able to use an idea at 150 words per minute, it has to be very well encoded your knowledge and your long-term memory, which means things that I'm just beginning to learn, vocabulary words, ideas that I'm just beginning to get my head around. It's very hard to incorporate those into your thinking at 150 words per minute. Yeah. A decent analogy for this would be, I'm trying to learn Spanish. I'm okay at Spanish. If I had to write how I would order in a restaurant, I could use the conditional, I could come up with like the words for, you know, I don't know, octopus and, you know, like pulpo, right? I can do that. But if I'm sitting in a restaurant and the waiter's standing there and I have to do it at 150 words per minute, there's no chance that I'm not fluid enough yet with my understanding of the conditional or with, you know, with vocabulary to be able to use it that fast. And so when we slow people down in their thinking, we allow them to use the ideas in the process of learning, nascent ideas, like new vocabulary terms, new ideas. They'll be more like, I have this beautiful video in the book it's actually from a math lesson. And the teacher said, write down your conjectures. Why might, you know, what might the graph of the line tell us? And this boy who answer says, the lines are there. He glances down, he says, they're coincidental, right? It's a really advanced mathematical term that he's using for the first time in his life. He's not even sure how to say it yet.
Yeah.
But it's so important because he's encoding that, he's incorporating that idea into his long-term memory, into his understanding, because he was allowed to think slowly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that these are some of the ways that writing, slow, durable, difficult, all the things that make writing difficult, things that make it beneficial to learning. And when we use AI, I think we shortcut a lot of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hope people who share your and my concern about what AI might be doing with faculties find a lot of value potentially in the chapter on writing and writing in the classroom.
Yeah. It reminds me of Angela Duckworth. I saw Angela Duckworth.
She's great,
because she was talking about how AI is going to require more teachers, not less, because we're going to need more people to motivate our kids to do hard things, because everything's going to be made easy for them. So how do we sort of instill the perseverance to kind of get through Animal Farm so that it's then part of who you are for the rest of your life? I'm talking to Doug Lemov. It's been a wonderful conversation. As we're getting close to conclusion here, Doug, first off, are there lightning round anything else in the book you wanted to hit quick before we wrap on the book?
I mean, there's so many things I'd love to keep talking about. I think one of the key takeaways from the book is that reading comprehension, that understanding a text is a knowledge-driven endeavor. I talked about some new information, new things we've learned about science, about attention. This is old science that we've known for a long time. If you look at a typical middle school or high school or late elementary reading lesson or English lesson, there's a presumption that interpreting text, understanding text is made up of a set of transferable skills, which is, if I learn this skill, I will be able to apply it to any text. So like inferencing would be an example of that. That somehow if I practice making 30 inferences from Tuck Everlasting, and someone explains to me, what are you doing when you make an inference? You are filling in the gaps between what the author told you and what the author left unsaid. And maybe I describe 7 steps to making an inference. But I will teach you to make inferences, and let's just close our eyes here and imagine this beautiful world. Now you will be able to make an inference from any text that you read for the rest of your life. It's a beautiful dream, but we should open our eyes now and realize that this is like fundamentally unscientific, that inferences are something you make when you have background knowledge. That like making 100 inferences from Tuck Everlasting will not help you to make inferences from Oliver Twist. That every text is full of ambiguities, inherent ambiguities. And what we do when we read is we disambiguate, and we disambiguate based on our background knowledge. So like a good example of this is, there's a sentence that we use in the book. So the wooden box was heavy. She put her bear down. It was going to be hard to carry, right? So will you tell me a little bit about that story? Who's the story about? What's happening in the story?
It's the girl who has to carry the heavy box. So I'm assuming she put her bear down, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so just the fact that, it has to be a teddy bear, not a real bear, right? Because
fair point.
She could not carry a bear, right? So that is a very simplistic example of background knowledge about basic things. You assumed it was a girl, and not, she was ambiguous. It could have been a grown woman, but like, who else would be carrying a teddy bear, right?
Fair point.
A girl. Yeah. The pronoun is ambiguous. Like, does it mean the bear was going to be heavy to carry, or the box was going to be? But you instantly disambiguated that because you have background knowledge about, the weights of things. And so that's a very simplistic example that when you have the background knowledge about a topic, you make inferences easily. And when you don't, you tend to make inferences, and practicing making inferences doesn't help. The classic study on this is called the baseball study, done by Recht and Leslie in the late 1980s. They gave a passage about baseball to a group of students, half of whom were high readers and half of whom were low readers. And then they divided those two groups, the high and the low readers, into kids who knew a lot about baseball and kids who didn't know a lot about baseball. And then they tested them on the passage. Some things that you would expect to have happen. The kids who were high readers and knew a lot about baseball did great. They got all the questions correct. And the kids who were low readers and didn't know anything about baseball did terribly. But the interesting thing was that the kids who were weak readers but knew a lot about baseball dramatically outperformed the kids who were strong readers but didn't know anything about baseball. Because when they talk about like a bunt and like sacrificing and, through to first, they knew, they understood all the unspoken inferences.
Mm.
And so the way that a lot of classrooms assume that we will teach kids to make inferences is by spending 45 minutes a day instead of reading, like talking about the process of inference making.
I see.
Much better to build knowledge into the classroom. So if we're reading a book, if I can take short nonfiction articles that illuminate, let's say we're reading Number of the Stars, it's a really beautiful, fairly iconic, fairly, canonical book in middle school years. It's set in World War II in Denmark during the Nazi occupation. And there's rationing, right? So there's no sugar and there's no butter. So if I insert a passage about rationing, why was there rationing? What did it mean for people? What did it do about rationing? And maybe I insert then like a nonfiction article the next day on resistance movements and what was sabotage and how did resistance movements work. And suddenly my students know more about the books that they're reading. They start to make more inferences. They're learning more from the text itself. So one of the big changes that we talk about having to happen is we have to shift from this transferable skills driven conception of what reading is to a knowledge-based conception of reading. A way to get students to do more higher thinking about the text and understand more about the text is to give them more knowledge to understand the text more productively. And the saddest part about the story is just how the fastest way to kill a book is to make it a vehicle for main ideating and to spend 45 minutes reading one paragraph and talking about what are the 7 steps we do to figure out the main idea. Of course kids don't want to read. It's brutal. Why would I bother reading, The Giver, which is one of the most beautiful imaginable books that I could give middle school students to read. And if they read The Giver deeply, I just firmly believe they will be much more likely to be sold on reading. But if I make that book a vehicle for inferencing and main ideating, right, why bother? Kill the book. And then it's really unclear, why are we reading these things anyway? What's the value in it?
Right.
So I think understanding the role of background knowledge in reading comprehension and understanding and higher order thinking is fundamental to how we think about and organize our reading classrooms. That science has simply not gotten to classrooms in the United States.
Amazing stuff here with Doug Lemov. We'll include links to his website and his new book, which is available now wherever you get your books. Doug's been a wonderful conversation. We kind of went from your history to founding Teach Like a Champion, seeing it take off, and now doubling down on the science of reading, which has always been something that's close to your heart. As folks head back to the rest of their lives, any concluding thoughts, any takeaways from today's conversation?
Yeah, thanks for asking. First of all, I really enjoyed it. It was super fun. One of the chapters that I know that resonates with you that we didn't really talk about that much is books, how important it is for students to read whole books.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of parents, I hope that they're educators on your podcast, but I think there are probably also a lot of parents. And I think a lot of parents would be surprised by how few books students read in schools now. And it's really, really important. So I would just flag that as a chapter that people want to take a look at and just maybe be alert to. We need to make sure that, books are the storehouse of the greatest thinking that we've done as societies. And we need to make sure that our kids are reading and still can read and can persist in reading books.
Amazing stuff. As a parent of a 6-year-old and the husband of a librarian, you're speaking my language here. Doug Lemov, amazing conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Been my pleasure.
And for our listeners, if you like what you heard, subscribe, write us reviews, share the good word. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.